Hello, and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 201, Mapping the World, or How Two Germans Invented America, which is also episode 16 of season 10, The Empire in the 15th Century. When you enter the Great Hall of the Thomas Jefferson building at the Library of Congress in Washington, the first exhibit you will be facing is their Gutenberg Bible, and is one of the finest Gutenberg Bibles around. One of only 3 surviving pristine copies on vellum. This was the kind of Bible that was so expensive to produce, it bankrupted Johannes Gutenberg. When the Library of Congress bought it in 1930, they paid $375,000, which is roughly $7.5 million in today's money. But this is not the most expensive piece in the library's collection. That would be the work by 2 Germans, Waldseemüller and Matthias Ringmann. And it's not even a book. It's a map. Not a small map. It is 2.3 meters or 91 inches wide and 1.3 meters or 50 inches tall. And this map, printed in 1507, claimed to be a description of the whole world on both a globe and a flat surface, with the insertion of those lands unknown to Ptolemy, discovered by recent men. And the authors wrote that the 3 continents known since antiquity, Europe, Africa, and Asia, quote, have in fact now been more widely explored, and a 4th part has been discovered by Amerigo Vespucci, as will be heard in what follows. Since both Asia and Africa received their names from women, I do not see why anyone should rightly prevent this new part from being called American, the land of Amerigo as it were, or America, after its discoverer, Americus, a man of perceptive character. End quote. This 4th part, they said, was surrounded on all sides by the ocean. And indeed, in the left lower corner we find a 4th continent, a thin, stretched thing with few place names and a western shore that hints at the Peruvian Bulge. Unmistakably South America. And then to the north a very indistinguishable blob of land. Now this map, proudly displayed as America's birth certificate, is full of the most intriguing mysteries. How did Waldseemüller and Ringmann know that the Americas had a western shore, when it was only in 1513, 6 years later, that a European first glanced the Pacific? How did the name America stick, though Amerigo Vespucci never led an expedition, not even commanded a ship? But most of all, why was this first map of America drawn not by a Spanish or a Portuguese navigator, but by 2 Germans in the employ of the Duke of Lorraine, working in Saint-Dié, which is as far away from the sea as one can get in Western Europe? And then, more generally, what did the Germans have to do with the discoveries, the maps and the globes that told the world about them? That is what we will explore in this episode. But before we start, a big thank you to all of you supporting the show, not only financially but also with your emails and messages of encouragement. As you can imagine, solo podcasting can be a bit of a lonely pursuit, and feedback, in particular your incredibly nice feedback, makes this so much more enjoyable. And today we should appreciate Guy C., Gary W., James M., Vincent V., Fabian S., Mike K., Joseph C., Duncan Hardy, whose upcoming book you can find in the book recommendations, and Eamon M., whose generous help at historyofthegermans.com/support keeps the enjoyment coming. And with that, back to the show. Maps have always exerted a huge influence on the human mind. I know that if I publish a post on social media with a map on it, it attracts 2 or 3 times the audience of my usual posts. Map making might go as far back as 7000 BC, when the Neolithic inhabitants of Çatalhöyük in Turkey painted a plan of their town and 2 distant volcanoes onto the walls of a house. The British Museum holds the oldest known world map, the Babylonian world map, that dates back to 600 BC. The story on how that had been identified as a map is one of the BM's best tales, by the way. Maps are not created equal. They do differ by accuracy, depth of information, and most importantly, purpose. Political maps emphasize the borders of countries, states, counties, constituencies, etc. Geographical maps Look at features like mountain ranges and rivers, the distribution of mineral deposits, or fertility of the soil. Sailors' charts care about depth and maritime hazards and give no heed to what's on the land unless it is a church tower or a lighthouse. Whilst the Michelin Guide divides the world into places to eat and those where better not to. I guess after 200 episodes observing our protagonists, and that's not just the kings and emperors, but also the monks, merchants and mercenaries crisscrossing the known world, I do not have to tell you that the medieval people were anything but static. Hence, it's not surprising that they made maps. How many is hard to say, but there are several that have come down to us. Amongst Anglo-Saxons, the Mappa Mundi of Hereford Cathedral is probably the best known. Whilst the German equivalent, the Ebstorf map, is a lot more famous here. Being the history of the Germans, we obviously focus on the Ebstorf map. First up, it's a huge circular image of the known world, 3.5 meters in circumference. Created around 1240, the original was lost in an air raid on Hanover in 1943, but we have several very detailed facsimiles. For modern observers, it's extremely difficult to get one's bearings on this map. For one, it's oriented towards the east, not the north. Then at the center of the map sits Jerusalem. Asia makes up the top half, Europe the bottom left, and Africa the bottom right. The Mediterranean is a giant T in the center that separates the 3 continents, with Sicily in the shape of a heart. The 3 continents are then surrounded by a thin band of one continuous ocean. Now, where it gets even more confusing is when you look closer. The map is extraordinarily detailed and comprises 2,345 entries, 845 pictures, 500 of which are buildings, the rest rivers, waterways, islands, but also 45 individuals and 60 animals. And these are on the one hand comparatively modern cities and features like Antwerp, Riga and the Brunswick Lion. And then it also depicts buildings and cities that are known to be long gone, like the Tower of Babel, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, or the city of Carthage. And then there are missing elements, like Cairo, the largest city Europeans regularly traveled to at the time, and instead it features entirely mythical locations, like the place where Alexander had imprisoned Gog and Magog, and the earthly paradise, complete with serpent and apple. So, what was this map for? The Ebstorf map reflected the sum total of the historical, scientific and theological knowledge at the time. That included the knowledge of the ancients that had made it through. Pliny the Elder was a particular favorite. For instance, his notion that the moon phases had a direct impact on the mental state of monkeys makes an appearance in the Africa chapter. Biblical stories were of such great importance to the pious, they were considered contemporaneous, even if they had happened 1,000 years earlier or longer. There was a major devotional element here. The map shows that the world is a confined space, held together by Jesus Christ, who sees and hears everything from his vantage point at the top of the map. What these kinds of maps, the Mappa Mundi, were utterly useless at was to guide a sailor from Venice to Constantinople and further on to the Holy Land. But we do know that at the same time these Mappa Mundi were made, Venetian, Genoese, Pisan and Amalfitani sea captains carried crusaders and goods to the east and came back. To achieve that, they could rely on the compass, accurate maritime charts, and pilot books. No, seriously. There are 3 maritime charts still in existence that were most likely produced around the same time as the Ebstorf map and the Hereford Mappa Mundi, so in the late 13th century. These maritime charts have no pictures of saints or exotic animals on them, nor do they share the wisdom of Pliny the Elder. These are utilitarian charts that tell you what course to steer and how far you have to sail to get from Palma de Mallorca to Palermo or from Ancona to Alexandria. It tells you where the submerged reef and rocks are and where the dangerous currents run. And they are pretty accurate, which is truly astounding as they did not use latitude or longitude to pinpoint locations. And then there is the scale of the effort. The so-called Pisan map covers the whole Mediterranean and the Black Sea, plus bits of the Atlantic. There are roughly 1,000 topographic sites named in the Mediterranean part alone, and all of these are on the coast or in the water, making this an incredibly dense map. Which begs the question how this information could have been gathered. One option is that it was a compilation of regional charts. But given every region had different measurements for miles and feet, it would have required a standardization down to the map's reference mile, which was 1.25 kilometers. Not an easy task. Some have argued that these charts were originally developed by Greek or Roman sailors and then copied and adjusted as trade routes changed and cities rose and fell. But there's no mention of maritime charts in Roman or Greek sources at all. So, in all likelihood, the makers of these maritime charts gathered information from the ship's captains who came in and out of their hometowns. And most cartographers were themselves retired seafarers, which must have helped them in these conversations. What bewildered me is that, according to the almost unanimous opinion in literature, the medieval navigators did not use a logbook or any other form of noting down the position, course, and speed throughout the voyage. This only came in during the 15th century when explorers ventured out to find a route to India. I find that incredibly hard to believe. As I said, the maritime charts did not feature latitude and longitude, meaning to determine a position, the skipper would have to constantly check the angle and distance to at least 2 landmarks, which changed all the time. And once on the open sea, he would have to remember exactly for how long he had stayed on which course and at which speed. Not impossible, but just very hard to do. If there had been logbooks, there would have been a huge help to the cartographers confirming the accuracy of their chart. But apparently they could keep it all in their heads. Accompanying these charts were portulans, something we would call today a pilot book. These are books guiding sailors through the entrance to ports, tell them what they will find there in terms of fresh water, provisions, facilities to make repairs, etc., etc. They even knew about compass variation, i.e. the fact that the magnetic north and the geographic north are not identical, and that this variation was not the same everywhere and that it changed over time. It is just mind-boggling to think that they knew that, but believed that bear cubs would have to be licked into shape by their mothers. As one can imagine, these two traditions of mapping the world started to coalesce in the great maritime republics in Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, and the seafaring Iberian kingdoms. One of the more famous of these hybrid maps that combine the historic and theological content of a mappa mundi with the accuracy of the maritime charts is the so-called Catalan Atlas. This map, created in 1375, not only incorporated the maritime charts of the Mediterranean, but also new information about places the ancients knew little about. Marco Polo had traveled to China in the late 13th century, and a trade in Chinese silks developed rapidly thereafter that brought Genoese traders to the courts of the Mongol rulers and further into mainland China. Their reports are included in the Catalan Atlas. The Canary Islands had been discovered in 1339, and its original population had been wiped out by disease and slaughter. So they, i.e. the islands, not their inhabitants, they too made it onto the map. So far, we have 2 mapping traditions that fused into one in the 14th century. The medieval mappa mundi that tried to educate about the way the world is, or should be, and the maritime charting tradition that cares about where exactly places are and how to get there. Then a third technique for map making appeared, or more precisely reappeared. In 1397, the Emperor of Constantinople, Manuel II Palaeologos, sent an ambassador to Venice, asking the Latin Christians for help in the defense against Ottoman attack. This ambassador, Manuel Chrysoloras, would become one of the catalysts of the Renaissance. Chrysoloras was not just a diplomat, but a classical scholar, philosopher, and teacher as well. Whilst his ambassadorship was a failure and no soldiers came to Manuel's aid, his cultural mission was a huge success. He had brought with him copies of classical Greek works that had been lost to the West for centuries, which he translated into Latin. He taught the intellectuals of Florence and Bologna to read Greek, and he published textbooks that were enthusiastically received. Within less than 100 years, Greek, which had largely been forgotten, returned to the curriculum of the educated classes all across the continent. Chrysoloras never returned to Constantinople, but established a constant flow of Greek books coming west. He died in 1413 en route to see the Emperor Sigismund to discuss a suitable location for the Great Church Council that would ultimately be held in Constance, episode 171-174. Amongst the treasures he carried in his luggage was a work by Ptolemy, the 2nd century Greek mathematician. This work, the Geography, would revolutionize the way maps were drawn. Now, if you put Ptolemy's Geography into a search engine, it will inevitably show you a map. But there are no maps by Ptolemy that survived from antiquity. What was found in the 13th century was a book with instructions on how to create a map of the world and 26 regional maps. And so, in around 1295, Byzantine scholars created a world map from the instructions Ptolemy had left 1,000 years earlier. The reason this worked was down to Ptolemy's great invention: longitude and latitude. The medieval maritime charts did not show long lat grids that almost every modern map now features. What they showed were rump lines, connecting lines between points on the map that showed the course to steer if you wanted to get from A to B. And these rump lines crisscrossed the map as commerce, not geography, demanded. Ptolemy's genius lay in his realization that to convey a 3-dimensional object, aka planet Earth, onto a 2-dimensional surface, aka a map, it required some sort of projection. And this was a minor problem when designing regional charts, but became a huge one trying to depict the entirety of the known world. And in this context, we need to clear up one constant misunderstanding. Very few people in the Middle Ages believed the Earth was flat. From the days of the ancient Greeks, people knew that the Earth was spherical. The very first globe was produced by Cratos of Malos in the 2nd century BC, and Eratosthenes had accurately calculated the circumference of the Earth based on the difference in the angle of the sun between Aswan and Alexandria. And fun fact, the term Antarctica also goes back to the ancient Greeks. It means literally land of no bears, being the opposite to the Arctics, which translates as land of the bears. Sadly, that had less to do with some intrepid traveler checking out the fauna on the North Pole, but with the star sign of Ursus Major that hovers over the north. But let's go back to the medieval understanding of the spherical structure of the Earth. Emperors from Charlemagne onwards received an orb as a sign of their power of the entire world, not a flat plate. Medieval maps were circular, and for instance the one Al-Idrisi produced for King Roger of Sicily in 1154 mentioned that the Earth was a sphere, as something that was common knowledge. So, when Columbus set off to seek the route to India by going west, the concern was less that his ships would fall off the edge of the world, but that the journey would simply be too long to be survivable. Given the circumference of the Earth was known, as was the eastward extent of Asia thanks to Marco Polo and other Italian travelers, one could estimate the distance from Seville to the Philippines or Japan at 20,000 kilometers or 13,000 miles. Given Columbus' ships were averaging 90 to 100 miles a day, the whole journey would be 150 days, well beyond their capacity to carry water and food. So Columbus got around that problem by mixing up Roman and Italian miles and pretending thereby that the world was 25% smaller, and by stretching China and Japan out further east than the reports warranted. So in his pitch to Ferdinand and Isabella, he claimed the distance was just 2,000 to 3,000 miles. Some historians believe he did that deliberately. How he thought he would survive is then unclear. He may have hoped that there would be islands along the way where he could find food, water and timber. Now okay, back to Ptolemy. Thanks to the curvature of the Earth, 2-dimensional maps will always get some dimension wrong, be it the surface area, the shapes, distances or direction. Which is why Ptolemy suggested to create globes rather than maps. But he also recognized that globes are difficult to produce and awkward to handle, so he offered 3 types of projections, each with advantages and disadvantages. That question of projections is the content of Book 1 of Ptolemy's Geography. The next 6 books contain 8,000 place names with their longitude and latitude, covering the whole known world from China to the mythical island of Thule in the far, far north. When Ptolemy's books reappeared and maps were drawn on their basis, there were a revolution, and copies were produced at a rapid pace. In 1409, the Geography was translated into Latin, and as we heard in episode 172, it was one of the central intellectual debates at the Council of Constance. What is interesting is how little the early copyists and publishers changed on these ancient maps. They showed the world its roads and cities as it was in around 200 AD. Little heed was given to the fact that in the intervening 1200 years many lands have been discovered, or at least better understood. Cities had vanished and new ones had emerged. Germany, an empty forested swamp in the 2nd century AD, was now a thriving place full of cities and roads, as was Poland, the Baltic and Scandinavia. In 1427, the Cardinal Philasty, an important protagonist at the council, asked the Danish traveller Conradus Clavus to create and then add a map of Scandinavia using Ptolemy's system of longitudes and latitudes, which he did, adding Greenland and Iceland as a bonus. But that was the exception. Most people just copied the ancient maps and left them as they were. So we end up with a scenario that we have on the one hand maps based on the medieval Mappa Mundi concept, but containing some very accurate maritime charts, the information gathered from the intensifying trade with the East, the Canaries, the Azores, the Cape Verde Islands and the coast of Africa, whilst at the same time the leading intellectual elites used a hugely advanced mapping method to present an even more massively outdated set of informations. It was a German, Donus Nicolaus Germanus, who was the first to fundamentally revise and improve Ptolemy in 1466. He translated or replaced the antique place names in Italy and Spain with modern names and a more accurate view of Northern Europe. We know little about him, apart from the fact that he was likely German, given his name, and that he worked in Florence and Rome. In 1477, Pope Sixtus IV ordered 2 globes to be produced by Nicolaus Germanus, one a celestial globe and one a terrestrial globe. We know that these globes were made because there are bills preserved in the Vatican Library, and the Marquis of Mantua asked for a copy in 1507. They were probably destroyed in the 1527 sack of Rome. That made Donus Nicolaus Germanus the first person we know for certain to have produced a globe since antiquity. By now, Gutenberg's printing press had radically changed the way information was distributed. Maps became an important product for printers. Several Ptolemy-based maps were published in Italy and Germany in the 1480s, but as people compared them to the information contained in the maritime charts, it became clear that Ptolemy, for all his innovative mathematics, was full of inaccuracies. In 1489, Henricus Martellus, another German, produced a world map that applied the longitude and latitude system of Ptolemy to the latest geographic information available. And latest really means latest. Bartolomeo Diaz had rounded the Cape of Good Hope in March 1488, returned to Lisbon in December 1488, and in 1490 Martellus' map shows Africa as being circumnavigable and even some shapes in the Indian Ocean that were previously unknown. Now, before we go down further on the route of German mapmakers, we have to mention someone else. Johannes Müller from Königsberg. Not Königsberg in Prussia, but Königsberg in Franconia. Since Müller was already a very common name, he called himself Regiomontanus, the Latinized form of his hometown. He was probably the most influential astrologer and mathematician in the generation before Copernicus. As you know, I dabble in all sorts of topics: literature, art, architecture, theology, philosophy, etc., but I draw the line at mathematics and linguistics. And it's not something I know anything about, nor do I feel capable of talking about it. So, if you want to know about the Regiomontanus paradox and his contribution to the development of calculus, you will need to find another podcast. But what I can talk about and what matters for our subject here is that Regiomontanus, alongside his mathematical works, produced a practical guide, the Ephemerides. These are tables showing the trajectory of astronomical objects, in particular the planets, their position, speed, and direction of movement at specific time intervals. These tables are naturally useful to astronomers, they're even more useful to astrologers, but they're absolutely crucial to navigators sailing into the southern hemisphere. One of the features of the southern hemisphere is that you cannot see the pole star anymore. The Southern Cross and the Sigma Octantis are reasonable replacements indicating south, but the Portuguese sailors following the African coast did not necessarily know that. What they could do instead is use the angles of the planets from their current location and time to determine where they were. And for that, they needed a reliable table telling them where the planets should be on that specific day and at that specific time. And that's where Regiomontanus came in. His tables, the Ephemerides, were more accurate and more detailed than anything else contemporaries had access to. Regiomontanus had developed and compiled these tables when he lived in Nuremberg in 1474. Nuremberg may not have a university that funded this kind of research, but what it had was a large number of rich merchants who combined commercial acumen with scientific curiosity. These men were happy to finance Regiomontanus' efforts and the publication of his tables in 1474. And these tables were a huge success and were still reprinted 300 years later. And at least one copy made it to the University of Krakow, where a certain N. Copernicus drew some literally earth-shattering conclusions using this data. In the last third of the 15th century, astronomy and geography were considered two sides of the same metal. They called it cosmology. So Regiomontanus did consider making maps, and as we have seen, some of the terrestrial map makers worked also on celestial globes. Thanks to these kinds of scientific endeavors and the rise of the printing press, the free imperial cities of the Holy Roman Empire became a key node in the distribution of knowledge about the planet. Nicolaus Germanus' modified atlas was printed in a luxury edition in Ulm in 1482. In 1486, Johannes Reger published a set of maps together with what he called a registrum, which allowed a cross-referencing of all of Ptolemy's place names with their modern notations. Over in Nuremberg, Hartmann Schedel compiled his famous Nuremberg Chronicle, which included two maps. One was a world map, a combination of Ptolemy's geography and the weird and wonderful elements of the medieval Mappa Mundi. The second map was something completely different. This was a map of Germany and Central Europe, the very first ever printed. It used the longitude and latitude now familiar to cartographers, but where Ptolemy had shown just empty spaces and swampy forest, it presented the magnificent Hanseatic cities, the trading centers of southern Germany, Krakow, Warsaw and Gdansk, the capitals of the Baltic states, and even Moscow and Lviv, but strangely not Kiev. The man who produced that Hieronymus Münzer was another one of that circle of intellectuals that emerged in Nuremberg. He undertook a journey to Spain and Portugal on behalf of the Emperor Maximilian to find out more about these new discoveries, and this produced one of the most detailed descriptions of the Iberian Peninsula in the 15th century. Because of the quaint half-timbered houses and the lack of an overseas empire, the idea has taken hold that 15th, 16th and 17th century Germans spent most of their time at home, while Spaniards, Portuguese, Dutch and English set out to conquer the world. And nothing could be further from the truth. As we heard in the season about the Hanseatic League and about the Fuggers, German merchants were going almost everywhere. They connected east and west and north and south. They had representatives in Lisbon, Antwerp, London, Bergen, Riga, Novgorod, Krakow, Budapest and Venice. Much of the timber the Portuguese caravels were made of came from the forests of Prussia, their design a development based on the cog. The copper and silver they traded into India and China came from the mines and smelters of the Fuggers, Welsers, Hirschvogels, and etc. In fact, these metals and some of the German metalwork were pretty much the only European exports the much more advanced societies of India, China, and Japan were interested in. Amongst the crews of the Portuguese explorers who set out into the unknown in the 15th century were almost always Germans. They were hired to operate the artillery. Germany had become highly regarded for the guns they produced and the gunners who had trained to operate them. The Portuguese called them bombardeiros alemães and hired them for most expeditions. In 1489, the Portuguese crown standardized its naval artillery to German-made bronze guns and their experienced gun teams. Of the 18 men who survived Magellan's circumnavigation, one was German, Hans de Planck, or Juan Aleman. Which gets us to the most controversial figure in the history of German cartography, Martin Beheim. So before we go into who he was and what he did or didn't do, there's one undeniable thing that is associated with him: the Erdapfel, the oldest terrestrial globe in existence today. As we know, it's not the oldest globe ever made. That was the one created in the 2nd century BC by Crates of Mallos, and it's not even the first one made after antiquity. That was the globe of Nicholas Germanus in Rome. All that being said, it is still the oldest globe in existence. And it is intriguing inasmuch as it was produced in 1492, in other words, just as Columbus was stepping ashore in the Bahamas. Giving timing, this globe does not show the Americas, and obviously neither does it show Australia or Antarctica. So what did Beheim put in the space where America is on the globe? Islands. Lots of them, some known, other invented. The Canaries and the Cape Verde Islands, today the jumping off point for an Atlantic crossing west, and the Azores, the staging post 2/3 on the way back east, were already known. But then he put dozens, even very large blobs all over the surface, and gave them names like the Antilles or the island of St. Brendan. Japan ends up more or less where Florida is. The Germanische Nationalmuseum in Nuremberg that holds the globe says in its description that the continents are too big. But I would be more accurate to say that the planet is too small, which may be down to Beheim subscribing to Columbus' view that the planet was a lot smaller than it actually is, and that hence sailing to China or Japan was feasible in one go. Which also ties in with the purpose of the globe. It was obviously not something one was supposed to take on a voyage. It was meant as a piece of decoration, ordered by the city council of Nuremberg to adorn their city hall. It conveyed the message that Nuremberg was at the forefront of intellectual development, was plugged into the worldwide flow of information, and had extraordinary artistic and mechanical skills. None of which was actually an exaggeration. But that is not the only purpose. Its real main purpose was commercial. Like the Mappa Mundi, the globe is covered in text. But this text does not contain any biblical events or spurious facts about exotic animals. It's about business opportunities. Where best to acquire rare materials like pearls, precious stones, spices, and luxury woods. It is here to entice the Nuremberg bankers and merchants to get involved in the financing of these journeys. So it is first and foremost a spherical pitch book. So far so good. A fascinating object from literally the year that changed history, and maybe a depiction of what Columbus expected to find when he sailed west. But why does it get almost everyone who writes about it so hot under the collar? David Blackburn, in his excellent book, Germany in the World, describes the maker of the globe, Martin Beheim, as a slightly raffish man of affairs whose exploits are almost grotesquely exaggerated. On the other end of the spectrum sit several German historians, and most recently the Polish historian Wojciech Iwańczyk, who entertained the idea that Beheim held an important role at court and in the commercial world of Lisbon during the time of the discoveries. According to him, Beheim introduced Regiomontanus Ephemeridis to the Portuguese and was appointed to the Royal Council of Navigational Experts. Beheim might have participated in at least 2 journeys down south, one leading to the discovery of the Congo. Iwańczyk even suggested Beheim may have known Columbus and might have shared his views on the journey west. I initially wanted to design this whole episode around Martin Beheim, the great explorer, scientist, and cartographer, a bit like I did with Johannes Gutenberg. But in the end, the evidence was all a bit too flimsy. It is a typical German story, inasmuch as that Beheim was pumped up relentlessly in the 19th century. Streets and schools named after him, statues erected, and even one of the oldest locomotives was named after him. The Nazis then went stratospheric, claiming Beheim had been the one convincing Columbus to sail west, that he had discovered Brazil before Cabral, and that he had sailed the Straits of Magellan before Magellan. Which created the typical post-war backlash, where any claim to fame was dismissed on the basis of a lack of explicit contemporary sources confirming it, until, well, there was nothing left than the story of a conman who died a pauper in Lisbon in 1507. And now everything is so convoluted and so vague that even the Germanische Nationalmuseum treads a careful balance, not dismissing the previous storylines completely, but being sufficiently vague not to get caught out. So here you go, Martin Beheim, explorer of far-flung lands and master cartographer, or exploiter of gullible city fathers. God only knows. Which gets us now to the final piece. The map in the Library of Congress they call the Waldseemüller map and America's birth certificate. At first glance, it is just another world map, a larger one, 2.3 meters by 1.3 meters. Europe is based on the Ptolemy maps, and the rest is based on maritime charts, Portuguese and Spanish discoverers' logs, and reports of the travelers to the east. Where it differs is in that long, stretchy landmass at the bottom left-hand corner that is surrounded by water and that bears a name that became familiar to all of us, America. In the copious notes, the authors explain that they named America after Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian navigator who went along on 4, maybe only 2 voyages along the South American coast, and who wrote 2 letters home about it, letters that had been massively bigged up by publishers and had become early bestsellers. What has confused scholars for centuries is how Martin Waldseemüller and Matthias Ringmann, the 2 makers of the map, could have known or could have guessed that America was a continent, and most authorities, including Columbus himself, believed the lands rediscovered in the West were part of Asia. And to rule one thing out, Amerigo Vespucci had never claimed that America was a continent. He might have called it Novo Mundus, New World, but that's not the same thing. And then comes the even more bewildering part. Not only is the positioning of South America fairly accurate, the map also shows the Pacific coast of South America with its characteristic bulge north of Chile. All that 6 years before Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama and became the first European to officially report the existence of the Pacific Ocean. How this was possible is the kind of question that sells books by the wagon load and got the Library of Congress to pay $10 million for a map. So let's take a look at some of these theories. I cannot do all of them because at some point I want to go to bed today, and so might you. Now, the simplest idea is that Waldseemüller and Ringmann, they just made it all up. They had Vespucci's exaggerated reports of the discoveries along the Atlantic coast of South America, and then spiced it up by showing the continent surrounded by water. And the key witness for this theory is Waldseemüller himself. In 1513 he produced another map that did not show a new continent in the West and did not call it America. In the explanatory note he said, quote, "As we have lately come to understand, our previous representation pleased very few people. Therefore, since true seekers of knowledge rarely color their words in confusing rhetoric and do not embellish facts with charm, but instead with a venerable abundance of simplicity, we must say that we cover our heads with a humble hood." End quote. But this admission does not mean they had willy-nilly made up an ocean that nobody had ever thought of. But that would be very much out of character. Waldseemüller and Ringmann provide references for much of what they show. They quote sources, ancient and modern, for the better-known regions, and the records of travelers for the parts of Africa, Eastern Europe, and Asia not well known to the ancients. And then there's a further aspect. The 2 mapmakers had been hired by the Duke René II of Lorraine to create these maps as a prestige project. The Duke wanted to impress his peers by setting up a humanist school in his duchy, and that humanist school had to produce something that would be widely respected as a great piece of scholarship. If Waldseemüller and Ringmann had consciously been making things up, they would have made their Duke the laughing stock of Europe, which could get very uncomfortable. Now there's a variation to that theory which has to do with the size of the world they show. Waldseemüller and Ringmann's map is in the main based on Ptolemy's geography. In fact, both authors had initially been hired to produce a revised version of the book rather than to draw up maps. It was only when the fake letters by Vespucci circulated in Europe that they decided to create a map instead. But where their map differs dramatically from other maps based on Ptolemy is in scale. This is one of the earliest maps that assumes 360 degrees of circumference of the Earth, rather than the 270 degrees, for instance, Beheim showed. In other words, Waldseemüller and Ringmann believed or knew that the world had a circumference of 40,000 kilometers. And they knew the distance from Europe to the Caribbean and South America, at which point the cartographers had to make a choice. Either one assumes that Asia stretches all the way to the Caribbean and the east coast of South America. That would make it a landmass that covers 50% of the planet. A continent of that size did not match up with Marco Polo and what other travelers had reported. So the only logical conclusion was that there must be an ocean between Asia and the newly discovered lands. It was admittedly a very bold assumption, but a justifiable one. Dr. Martin Lehmann from the University of Freiburg took a closer look at the political environment in which the map was created. As I mentioned, Waldseemüller and Ringmann worked for Duke René II of Lorraine, a prince on the western edge of the Holy Roman Empire at a place called Saint-Dié. Saint-Dié is roughly 100 kilometers from Strasbourg and 80 kilometers from Nancy in the middle of a forest. In other words, it is in the middle of absolutely nowhere, hundreds of miles from the sea and even further away from Lisbon, Cadiz and Seville. Now, since the map is correct in many respects, there is at least a theoretical option that it was based on information from voyages that had been kept secret. Which leads straight to the question, how could such incredibly valuable secrets end up in the hands of two guys hired by a mid-level prince in a dark forest? Makes no sense, or maybe does it? Spain and Portugal were in a fierce competition. Not over who could find America, that was not interesting at the time, but over the route to India and, even more important, the route to the Spice Islands of Indonesia and the Philippines. Being able to obtain these spices at source would cut out the middlemen, aka India, the Silk Road and Venice, and the enormous margins that paid for the palazzi on the Canale Grande. In this race to get to the Malacca Islands, the Portuguese travelled eastwards, while the Spaniards, who were a lot later to the game, had to travel westwards. In 1494, the two sides had agreed the Treaty of Tordesillas. That is often described as Spain and Portugal dividing the world between themselves, but that's not quite true. What Tordesillas said is that Portugal had the exclusive right to sail eastwards and find the Spice Islands, while Spain was free to seek their fortune in the west. And then may the best man win. So both sides were racing to the same spot, which is roughly 1,200 kilometers north of Australia. Which means neither side wanted the other side to know what they were up to. That is why very few maps have been published in Seville, Lisbon or Cadiz, which is where the explorers made landfall and where the best information about the new discoveries could be obtained. Sure, the Spanish and the Portuguese produced maps, but they were only made accessible to the select few. And they kept voyages secret. So for instance, it's widely believed that the Portuguese knew about Brazil's shape before the official discovery in 1500. But all that secrecy had its drawbacks. This was a winner-takes-all race. Both sides wanted to send as many fleets as possible in the hope that at least one of them makes it through. It was a venture capital approach which needed venture capitalists willing to share some of the costs and the risks of the voyages. This was the 15th century equivalent of the streaming wars, the race for AI leadership, or the rush to dominate the ride-sharing industry. And where were these financiers? With the Italian banking houses in decline, it was the southern German mercantile firms, the Fuggers, Welsers, Imhoffs, Tuchers, etc. that were obvious business partners for the Iberian kings. But if you wanted to get them on board, you needed to lift up the skirt a bit. That is the reason Martin Beheim was allowed to put a fairly detailed map of West Africa onto his globe, information that almost certainly came from Portugal. And that could also explain the astounding accuracy of the Waldseemüller map. If the Portuguese had information about the west coast of South America and would have wanted to share it, well, they would have probably used someone in the German lands. But I personally find it hard to believe that they managed to sail up the whole of the west coast of South America to Panama and then made it back all before 1507. And what for? This was the route they had ceded to the Spanish, and the Spanish are unlikely to have furnished that information, since they would have insisted on naming the continent after Columbus, not Vespucci. Which gets to the next twist in the theory. Let's put yourself into the shoes of a Portuguese strategist in 1505-1506. You cannot know whether or not the Spaniards are in with a chance to make the race. But if you could find a way to slow them down, well, that would certainly be worth something. What if you could convince the Spaniards that there was an enormous landmass and another ocean between them and the Spice Islands? Maybe that could discourage them from sending as many ships. or more importantly, it could hold their investors up from funding these efforts. And who could be a better vehicle to convey this message than a group of humanists locked up in a village in the Vosges Mountains trying desperately to impress the ducal sponsor? Like journalists at a minor newspaper, they were looking for the great scoop that would put them onto the national news. So it may be that the Portuguese suggested to Waldseemüller and Ringmann that South America was surrounded by water, even though they did not know that for a fact. That may also explain why the letters published in 1503 and 1504 and attributed to Vespucci are unlikely to be by his own hand and are full of exaggerations and inaccuracies that could all be part of a larger sting operation. But as my father-in-law used to say, if it is a choice between cock-up and conspiracy, 9 out of 10 times, it's just a cock-up. So irrespective of whether Waldseemüller and Ringmann were duped or dupers, the name America went around the world. The original print run of their map was 1,000 copies. The name America then shows up on the so-called Green Globe in Paris from that same year, and then in the Jagiellonian Globe from 1510 that was produced in Krakow. Johannes Schöner, who was the owner of the only surviving copy of the Waldseemüller 1507 map, includes America in his 2 globes from 1515 and 1520. From there it meanders across Europe. Between 1520 and 1540, reprints and slightly revised versions of Waldseemüller's map are published in Vienna, Paris, Strasbourg, Basel and Zurich. Finally, in 1538, Gerard Mercator, he of the Mercator projection, published a world map, where he was the first to declare the existence of 2 continents, South America and North America. And once the terms had been embraced by the foremost geographer of the time, despite the vigorous objections from the Spanish side, the naming had become irrevocable. There you have it. The name America came about because a bunch of German humanists stuck in the back of beyond either made up or were made to make up a continent that then actually turned out to be real. And people say Bielefeld does not exist. Thanks for listening. This was a bit of a long one and I apologize. I was carried away by far too many fascinating facts. But if you have listened all the way, I guess you like them too. Next week will be the last of our deviations around the Holy Roman Empire in the 15th century. What we'll be talking about is arms and armor, the greatest of the German exports in the 15th and 16th century and beyond. Shah Jahan, the great Mughal emperor and the man who commissioned the Taj Mahal, counted 200 Firangi swords amongst his most valuable possessions. Firangi means foreigner. The blades of these foreign swords came from Solingen in Germany. How Germany gained its reputation as the source of the finest weapons and armor around is what we will discuss next week. I hope you will join us again.